Up outside Glasgow's Queen Elizabeth University Hospital yesterday as part of an ongoing anti-abortion protest during Lent. A bill to introduce abortion buffer zones, basically where people are not allowed to protest so close to clinics, is set to be supported by the Scottish Government. Similar bills have already been approved in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Well, a doctor in Glasgow yesterday posted a video pleading directly to First Minister Humza Yousaf to fast-track the legislation here in Scotland. And we asked the First Minister about his response to that this morning.
We're going to do everything we possibly can to bring safe access zones to our abortion facilities and clinics as soon as we possibly can. I'll engage very early on with Gillian Mackay, who is the member, of course, that's bringing forward the Members' Bill in relation to safe access zones. But I've made it unequivocally clear that I am in support of them, and I'm really disheartened to see those protests take place at a time when women are maybe facing some of their most traumatic, having a very traumatic experience, one of the most traumatic days potentially even in their lives. To have to face that type of protest for me is just not acceptable.
Well, let's discuss this now with abortion rights campaigner Gemma Clark and also with Lois McClatchy, who's from ADF UK, a faith-based legal advocacy organisation, and she's against buffer zones. Good afternoon to both of you.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
Hi there. Gemma, let's start with you then. So we heard there from Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, saying that he supports them and he'll do everything he can, in fact, to make sure that they go ahead in Scotland. Similar bills have already been approved in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. What's the situation here in Scotland?
Yeah, in Scotland we're actually now behind the rest of the UK, so it's great news to have Humza Yousaf as First Minister because he's very outspokenly supportive of abortion rights, and that's very reassuring. But Westminster passed their buffer zone legislation at the beginning of March. Northern Ireland have already got buffer zones, and these have already stood up to legal challenge at the Supreme Court. So we're now in the situation where Scotland is lagging behind the rest of the UK. So this is something that needs to be done as quickly as possible. What we have in Scotland now is a increasingly desperate and nasty anti-abortion movement, and patients are suffering. That's still going on now, so it's something that needs to be urgently addressed.
Lois, do you think that it's fair that more than 100 people should be able to turn up outside a hospital offering these kind of services?
So I think we have to bring a bit of balance and proportionality for this conversation when we're thinking about buffer zones. And there is a conversation about whether 100 people was the most effective way to be praying or offering charitable help. But the reality is that happens once a year, is that scale of people. The majority of the times, and research from the UK government shows this, the vast majority of people who pray or offer help outside of clinics do it in pairs, and they do it very peacefully and might be silently praying or just offering a leaflet about support available for women who might like it. And it's those people who are carrying out legal and peaceful activities that would be banned and censored by this very far-reaching bill.
So I'll ask you again then, should 100 people, more than 100 people, have been able to turn up yesterday at a hospital?
The question here is about the legislation that would be going through the Scottish Parliament, and that would be much more, don't miss the wood for the trees there, it would be much more than banning what would be considered harassment. It would be more than tackling situations. If you think it's wrong to have 100 people, it would go much further than that. It would tackle even having one person silently, individually praying inside their head outside an abortion facility. We've seen in England, where some councils have implemented buffer zones already, that we've had instances of one person saying that admitting to the police that she was silently praying in her head, minding her own business, not manifesting any signs, not being aggressive in any way, but just simply praying. And she was criminally charged for what she did. And we would see this sweeping across Scotland. So we need to make sure that the government have balance and proportionality as they make sure that people who are just doing legal and peaceful activities are protected.
Gemma, your response to that then, do the proposed bill that's going to be considered by the Scottish Parliament, does it go too far? Is there somewhere in the middle that we could find here?
No, I don't think there's any both sides in this debate, and I'm not surprised to hear such a disingenuous answer about a mob of 100 people picketing a hospital last night. It's completely inappropriate, and even if that only happens once a year, that is no comfort to people who could be in there taking their child to A&E, having a stillborn, having a miscarriage, having suffered an assault. That is no comfort to these people who are having probably one of the most traumatic days of their life being made worse. I'm not surprised to hear this from an ADF representative. The Southern Poverty Law Centre categorised this group as a homophobic hate group. Their own footage show that this lady who was arrested told the police that she was deliberately in the buffer zone because it was an abortion clinic. So let's be honest about who these people are. We're talking about highly radicalised anti-abortion activists who are working for highly funded American organisations. This is not about freedom of speech. This is about protecting women and vulnerable people who need to be able to access these hospitals safely without fear of intimidation and harassment.
Lotus, your response to that?
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's really important to be honest and accurate in this debate. And Gemma's quoted some spurious allegations from discredited hate groups, discredited groups over in America that have actually been facing allegations for spreading lies themselves. So it's very important that we're very honest about what's going on. And the language used around those groups, it's not a mob, they're praying. It's important that people have the freedom to pray in their heads in the UK. And now, one thing that I will agree with Gemma on is that I also absolutely stand against harassment against women and any circumstance, not only outside an abortion facility, but there too, absolutely. And that's not what we're dealing with here. There's already legislation in place to deal with harassment. What we're talking about here is legislation that would go so far as to put censorship on innocent people who are offering charitable help. And we, as a UK-based charity, that's what we support, and I wouldn't take any of those allegations. I would really reject all of those.
If somebody was standing there then silently praying in their head, why do they need to be physically so close to a clinic? Why can they not do that somewhere else? If it's not about being seen by the women and others that are going into the clinic.
Sure, yeah. So there's two good reasons for that. One is that for people who are praying, time and space is important to them. You might think of somebody who leaves flowers on the side of a road where someone has died, marking that time and space, saying a prayer in their heads at that point. And for people who are praying about women who are facing this difficult choice, and a lot of the women who go out to pray have themselves,
even if it's going to cause even if it's going to then upset that very woman in that moment.
Well, what we need to do is hear from the women themselves who have benefited, because they're not only praying. A lot of the people who are involved in this charitable work is handing out leaflets about support available to continue pregnancy if they want it. And we know from women who have benefited from that support, hundreds of testimonies, that they were grateful to, at their moment of need, right when they needed to make that decision, they received that lifeline of support and made a life-changing decision.
So they're not silently praying in their heads then, they're also handing out leaflets.
Well, these are two separate activities that we know are the most common, thanks to the government review in 2018 outside of a clinic. It would be silently praying or offering charitable support. And the typical way would be a pair of two, and maybe one's praying and maybe one has leaflets available for those who would like to chat. That's a typical engagement from these pro-life prayer vigils. And for those women who want to benefit from those offers of help, and there's hundreds who have benefited from that charitable support, whether it's housing, baby supplies, anything else, they have said that they want to keep those options open for other women in their shoes facing crisis pregnancies today.
And we know we're talking about this issue, and obviously we can't represent the feelings of every single woman that's been impacted here, and I think it's quite important to say that, but we are trying to have a discussion about the issue in general. Gemma, the point about freedom of expression and freedom to have a religious belief and freedom to pray, what do you make of that? And I guess when we start to shut that down, what does that mean for society?
Well, that's not something that buffer zones interfere with. What the buffer zone would do is create a very short distance of 150 metres where protesters need to stay away from the entrance to the hospital. I've been contacted over the last 24 hours by people who have had signs of fetuses thrusted at them. They've been chanted at. They've had things about Satan chanted at them. It's completely inappropriate. Anybody who is against harassment supports buffer zones. And not that we should need academic peer-reviewed research to validate women's experiences, but we actually do have that. Dr. Pam Lowe from the University of Aston, she's an expert on this. She has lots of research that documents that people entering these clinics, when they're faced with protesters, they feel like they're under unwanted surveillance, that their privacy has been invaded, and they feel like they're being accosted by strangers and being asked to discuss very private medical issues.
Gemma, thank you for your time. Lois, to really appreciate both of you coming on to speak to us today. Abortion rights campaigner Gemma Clark and Lois McClatchy, who's from ADF UK, a faith-based legal advocacy organisation.
Now, a Russian anti-war